Hi guys. Hi. I think can everyone see us now? I think they can. Just to introduce ourselves. So my name is James Payne, and my channel is Great Art Explained, and that's me. That's enough for me.
I'm Rowan Ellis, and my channel is Rowan Ellis, and I essentially do video essays, long form videos about queer culture and history, and so together we make team queer art for Google Arts and Culture for today, taking you through some exciting looks at queer history, queer art, queer artists, and the question of what even is queer art anyway. So obviously this is not a lecture necessarily. We're going to be talking about art and artists and giving you some examples, but we want to hear what you think as well. So the kinds of questions that we're going to be asking and looking at today, does it matter if an artist is LGBTQ+? Let us know in the comment section. We've got it up, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Put some comments and some questions down below. Does it matter if they're queer? If an artist's work is not explicitly queer in its content, does it matter if they identify as LGBTQ+ or not? Is that something that you look at when you look at art, the artist's background, their identity? Is that something that's interesting to you? We would love to know.
Okay, so if we could pull up the first image, please. And we're going to just to have an image up while we're talking. And does anyone know who this is? We'll just go a little bit closer on that image, please. So pull in a little bit closer. No, don't give me the name. And if anyone knows that image, just put it in the, there you go. Fantastic, beautiful image there. So listen, it's really important in this discussion. I mean, as Rowan's talking, I'm hearing the word queer all the time, which for someone of my age is a strange thing to hear. But now we're going to discuss the differences between, what is gay, what is queer, what is LGBT, what is LGBTQ+, etc., etc. But we're not trying to tell anyone what to think. That is not what either of us are interested in. The whole point of art is to be seen in many different ways, and that's really why I love art. You can look at it in so many ways. Many writers like John Berger look at art from a Marxist point of view. You can also look at art from a conservative point of view. It really adds to the whole mix of what makes art, and that is why we're here. And for you guys, would be really great if you could kind of comment on what we're talking about as well, because it really is a discussion. Does anyone pick up who that artist was, by the way? I think the best example of what we're talking about is that many people watched my Andy Warhol video about the painting Marilyn, and most people had no idea he was deeply religious and went to church every day and had a collection of religious icons. And really, if you just take that one little fact about Andy Warhol and something you've learnt about him, it really changes the way you look at Marilyn as an icon, his painting of Marilyn as a religious icon. And that's what we want to do, is make you look at something in a different way. So in many cases, the artist's sexuality doesn't seem important to the interpretation of their work, and particularly if that work doesn't explicitly address sexuality. But this is all about context, in the way that Van Gogh is very important to know about his mental health issues. With Frida Kahlo, it's very important to know about her physical health issues, because in both cases that really affected their art. And for some people, being gay, being LGBTQ, or being queer is really important. Even one of the artists we're talking about later on, Moholy, it's illegal to be gay in certain countries, where these people are operating. So all of those things are very interesting. So to neglect a part of someone's character, whether you agree or disagree with it, it skewers history and it deletes context. And this is true with everyone. So I think sometimes, just to finish up this little point, sometimes this was a function of survival on behalf of the artist. Many artists hid that they were gay, as did many people. But often it's a conservative framework, which Rowan's going to talk about later on, of art institutions themselves. Like a picture on a wall is the be all and end of everything, but it's not. Next image come up, please, just while we're talking. And Rowan in a sec is going to talk about the concept of queer and gayness, etc., etc. This is Catherine Opie, by the way, a brilliant artist. lesbian artist, and this image is called Dyke. It's from 1993, and it's important to uncover these hidden storylines and lives for the sake of these artists. Just remember as well, this is the truer writing of history. What I was thinking about literally just before we came on air is so many people complain about statues being taken down because it's taking away part of one's history, and yet they're willing to delete somebody else's history, you know. So this is what we're here to discuss. So if Rowan, if maybe you could talk about the whole concept, because to be honest, I don't understand everything either.
Of course. Okay, so when we have live streams like this, we have kind of people who are coming at it from the angle of queerness, who are like, oh, I'd love to learn more about this history as a queer person. And then also potentially people who are like, I love art, kind of queer art is a part of art, but I don't know much about it. So I thought I'd give a little preface to this because I think it's really interesting. A lot of people will hear words like queer and are not entirely sure how it's used within an artistic space. So first of all, historically, originally, of course, queer had much more general meaning of, you know, something odd or strange. There's now as queer as folk, of course, a classic proverb from my home country of Yorkshire. But we see a shift in the use of the word to mean more of an insult specifically against men with same-sex desires or those that were gender non-conforming. And so, you know, these ideas of what we think of now as being sexuality and gender expression that are not necessarily the same thing, then were conflated by many at the time, and it was sort of a catch-all insult. And then this insult starts expanding to anyone that we might nowadays label under the LGBTQ+ umbrella. And were also used within the community itself, even back then. You know, similar to labels like fairy, like sissy, which we would consider now to be like very insulting. At the time, these were labels that people were also using as identifiers. And so we come to this kind of reclaiming of the word queer, which is often tied into academia, into theory, as well as into political movements, activist movements, kind of from the 1980s onwards. So nowadays, it has kind of two different ways that people use it. One of them is as an umbrella term. So it might be used as an umbrella term for the whole of the LGBTQ+ community, a sort of catch-all for people who fall under it, because it is like a single word that means you don't have to sort of label every single identity under that umbrella to talk about the community. And it also might be useful for us when we talk about historical figures who lived before modern sexuality and gender terminology. Queer is a very all-encompassing word, and so we're not putting a definitive label on them, but we're saying that they fall somewhere within this spectrum. So it gives kind of room for ambiguity, room for nuance. But nowadays it's also used as an identity in and of itself. People might identify as queer in the same way that they identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual, but it is still a term which has some debate behind it. Some people still see it being tied to its use as a slur. They're not comfortable kind of having the word used to describe themselves. So it's a really interesting loaded term. It has a very strong history within art history, and I'll talk a little bit more about kind of queer theory specifically later. But I think now we're going to talk about kind of dive into one particular artist to kick off our discussion about how this might have an effect on how we see art, even centuries old art.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting here. If we could pull up the next image, please, that would be great. So yeah, this is Dying Slave by Michelangelo. So this is kind of around 1500 roughly. I always use 1500 as a cutoff point. It's nice and easy. And this was for the tomb of Pope Julius II. There are lots of these lying around all over the world, dying slaves. But this particular one is very homoerotic. I kind of wanted to look at Michelangelo because I posted during Gay Pride Week, I posted an image of Michelangelo. And I said, do you think Michelangelo was gay? Is the Pope Catholic? I put on there, and I got a lot of flack for it, actually. I got a lot of negative things saying, why does it matter? Why does it matter? It's, well, it's still disputed, for example, whether Michelangelo was gay, which I think is kind of boring, it's tedious to say this, but why shouldn't some little kid going through crap and facing homophobia not have heroes too? This is a hero for young kids, and history has made us think he was heterosexual. But if we look at his poetry, which you can talk about in a minute, this was originally published as if it was poetry written for a woman. So we know that's like a 500-year-old piece of fake news. Someone did that 500 years ago. Because in the 1860s, a guy called John Addington Symonds, he was a gay art historian. He discovered a note from Michelangelo's grandnephew. All of this history is really important. So his grandnephew wrote in the margins of Michelangelo's love poetry saying they should not be published in their original form because they expressed masculine love. So when he prepared them to be published for the first time, they were published for the first time in the 1620s, he had all of the masculine pronouns changed. So he had them all changed to feminine pronouns, which meant that any statements in the poems that could not be interpreted as platonic, let's say, which a lot of people claim they are, would at least be interpreted as what is considered normal, i.e. what we call heterosexual. And so those pronouns were changed. So the whole thinking was changed. And that took 500 years to the 1960s before someone said, hold on a second. So now if we could pull up the next image here. And Rowan, if you want to talk about the poetry, that'd be great.
Yeah, I love Cheryl in the chat has just said, without sexuality as a dynamic, you do not have the complete story. And it's so interesting what you've just said, Cheryl, and what James has said about that it took so long for this to come to light, because now we know a bit more about it. So this sonnet is dedicated to a young nobleman named Tommaso de' Cavalieri. In fact, Michelangelo's poems to this particular nobleman comprised his largest cohesive sequence in his poetic work. And so when we're looking at evidence for the kind of relationship they might have had, or specifically his feelings towards this man, we can look at things like the homoerotic tone of the poetry. So he describes wanting to be like this man's clothing, to be able to wrap himself around his body, to be his shoes, to be able to kiss his feet. And so a lot of people will see this and ask questions like, do we think this relationship was physical? Was it romantic? Was it mutual? And these are questions that we will never know the answer to, right? These are things that are going on that we don't necessarily have records for. But what we do know is that the censoring of the words, it tells us that whatever was happening within this work was considered more than or different to typical male friendship at any rate. And so we know about the poems that were written to this man, but we also know people have speculated that he might have also been the model for some of Michelangelo's most famous artworks, including the image of Christ in his Last Judgment for the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah, someone's just put in the comments he has pretty handwriting. Michelangelo had the prettiest handwriting, actually, and you can read it, which is compared to Leonardo is very, very important. I would say actually one thing is if you don't want the truth to be discovered, don't write notes in the margins, please, because it's exactly the same story with Leonardo da Vinci. And the identity of the Mona Lisa is they discovered in the 20th century, they discovered a note written in the hand margins, and the same story happened again with an image of hell. So don't write in margins. So if we could go to the next picture, please. Next image coming up. This is a sketch here. Just stay where you are for the moment on the image. I just think, just look at that image. The thing is with Michelangelo, you can look at an image and really it's kind of it's almost like his pencil doesn't touch the page. It's so beautiful. It's so light and tender. Now if we can go in close slowly to the face, that would be great. This is a sketch here. This is probably the guy Rowan mentioned. A little bit, yeah, I think that's about as close as we can get. This is the guy that Rowan mentioned, Cavalieri. And this is a sketch for his image of Christ from the Sistine Chapel, which if anyone has seen, the Sistine Chapel is controlled by the Pope. and the Pope doesn't let us use any of his images, so we can't use any Sistine Chapel images. They're all copyrighted by the Pope and a Japanese company, so you're just going to have to look them up afterwards yourself. But if you've seen Christ in the thing, you know, he's standing up judging people, and it's really a picture of Apollo. You know, it's Christ without a beard in that image as well, and that is Cavalieri, most people think. I'm going to move on from here. You can keep the same image up. We're going to talk about the Sistine Chapel for a bit, because there's two things in the Sistine Chapel which kind of give us little clues here. So one is we have a series of 20 seated male nudes in the Sistine Chapel. We're not allowed to show them on here because of copyright, and they're called ignudi or ignudi. Yeah, ignudi in Italian, and that's coming from the Italian word nudo, which means naked, and in its singular form it's ignudo. And so these are young, athletic male nudes in pairs of 4. They're kind of in the corners. Now, what's really important about this is in the Sistine Chapel, everything is related to the Bible. Every single thing is related to the Bible, not these. They're not in the Bible. Why are they there then? So why are they there? Are they angels looking on the story unfolding around them? Or are they idealized men representing the artist's desires, you know? And the post I mentioned earlier on from Instagram, which I posted, that was from the Last Judgment of the Sistine Chapel. And in the Last Judgment of the Sistine Chapel are 2 men kissing. They are kissing. They're not pretending to kiss. They're not might be kissing or anything of that. They're kissing. And not only are they kissing, where would you expect, you can put comments in the comments if you want to, where would you expect them to be on the Last Judgment? Going down to hell or being lifted up to heaven? So where would you expect 2 men kissing to be sent down to? Well, actually, in this particular image, they're being risen up to heaven. And that is a choice by Michelangelo, who did 99% of the Sistine Chapel himself, nobody helping. The last thing I want to say about Michelangelo, if we could bring up the other image, please. The next image. But the last thing I want to say about Michelangelo, I think these are ideas about Michelangelo from history. Michelangelo is gay, people think, but he was also very religious and he was very tortured. I think those 3 things are very true. I do think it's a myth that he never acted on it. I think it's just to make him more palatable to say that he had these gay thoughts but didn't act on them. So this is David, and another image from Michelangelo, and this is possibly Febo di Poggio. And Febo di Poggio was another possibility for a lover of Michelangelo, and he used to nickname him, he called him the Little Blackmailer, which kind of tells you quite a lot, I think. And Michelangelo wrote poems dedicated to him. Now his name is Poggio, and Poggio in Italian means little hill, like a hillock, we say in English. And his poems dedicated to him are about him falling on top of a hill, and exhausting himself. So it's all suggestion of physical consummation. I think the common thread, which would be probably more your area, Rowan, is that Michelangelo really had quite little in common with what you would call a gay person today. But then again, he might be more comparable to what we call queer today. Possibly, I don't know.
So this is actually an excellent time to talk a little bit about what I was mentioning earlier, the idea of like queerness being something which is ambiguous, which is nuanced, which is useful for us as historians, as art historians, to talk about, put a label on something that's quite ephemeral in an ironic way. So as we mentioned earlier, we might have some trouble finding and labeling queer art through the canon for a variety of reasons. So I know that myself, and I'm sure many other queer people, have had the reasonably depressing experience of finding out you're queer, you're LGBTQ+, and trying to dig into your history, and essentially just discovering a lot of nothing, a lot of invisibility, a lot of legacies being destroyed, like, you know, pronouns being changed in poems, and just generally, you know, the dangers of queer love in throughout history. You know, if you think about it, if you're for many years, many centuries, and even still in some countries today, if your identity, if your sexuality or gender is criminalized, how likely are you to keep indisputable records of your supposed crimes? And even if you did, would your family, looking at the life of Michelangelo, for example, and countless others, be likely to keep those records and preserve them, or to destroy them, let alone celebrate them? And so even, post decriminalization, we still see a lot of prejudice towards LGBTQ plus people, influencing not necessarily what queer people are creating, but who is being celebrated. Who is being put up in galleries, who is being talked about. And when we look at the fact that we have very high instances of queer homelessness and poverty, that's also going to affect it in a wide-reaching way. Who has access to the art establishment, who has access to materials to produce art. And all of this it kind of compounds to mean that we obviously have queer art. Throughout the centuries, queer people have been producing it, but where it sits in the canon is of particular interest and particularly relevant. So, if you think about at school, were you taught in art class or in any class about LGBTQ plus people and their contributions? Were you taken on a trip to the LGBT History Museum? If you live in the UK, you certainly weren't, because there weren't any up until extremely recently in the last year or two. Did you have family members passing down stories or history to you of queer artists that they admired in the way they might have done to do with, your mother might have told you about women artists that she admired? Did you get taught about it in school? Probably not. This lack of education kind of just compounds the issue. And there's also very few places for LGBTQ plus people to gather that aren't based around socializing with alcohol, bars, clubs, things like that, which also stops a lot of intergenerational community forming and talking about these kind of things. And so we also get these gaps, right? Not just of queer people, but all the other gaps that we see within the art canon, the women, non-binary people, trans people, people of color, those all interlink, they all cross over. And so the people most marginalized are often the least likely to have their voices heard kind of within the canon. But we didn't just spring up in the 20th century. We've always been here. It's just about trying to dig through that history and find the evidence. And it is so important for us to do that, because it not only creates a sense of community and culture and legacy for a marginalized group that has been persecuted and ignored, but it's also a way of just reflecting reality, right? Reflecting the reality of our history and the reality of the impact that we have and can have. So I mentioned earlier about queer studies, and I'd go more into that. So queer theory essentially is, a type of theory that we might use in history and art that acknowledges that, the modern terms and definitions that we use for our community have not been the same throughout history, have not been the same across cultures. Does it matter if someone in the 1700s was a woman dressing in men's clothing for fun, for opportunity, or because she potentially in the 21st century would have had a trans identity? Does that matter? A lot of queer theory says no, because the act itself is in opposition to the gender norms of the time. And so in any case, for whatever reason, that's queer. So it's interested in crossing social boundaries, not fitting into expected categories, pushing against the norms. And so for a lot of people who talk about queer theory, queer is something that you do rather than, something that is an identity that you are. It's something you actively partake in. And so you can be LGBTQ plus and not queer within queer theory. So an example of that I want to quickly talk about would be, the idea of queerness being connected to social convention and traditions is particularly interesting when we look outside of the Western canon. So ideas of gender have changed and shifted in the West, of course, but also around the world over the centuries. So, some cultures have more than 2 recognized genders. We often differ in the way that men and women are traditionally meant to act or dress. So if we go on to the next slide, the next piece of art, we can see that, you know, anyone who's ever looked at a piece of art, has ever studied a piece of art, knows that there are connotations, there are symbols that we bring to it from our culture, but they're going to differ between cultures. You know, what colors symbolize will differ, what the way that gender is presented will differ. And I think this piece from Kim Jeeun is a perfect example of that. So you look at this piece and you might say, well, those are two pairs of shoes. If you're unfamiliar with Korean traditions, it might seem to have nothing really to do with gender. But when you know that the pair on the left are traditionally worn by men and the pair on the right by women, it starts to build meaning in. So this piece is called A Pair. And the artist, she said, of these very intricate paper material sculptures, I place these two shoes next to each other but facing in opposite directions. I'm questioning the definition of pair. So if you go on to the next slide, the next piece, we can also see how, similar to, you know, the idea of the Sistine Chapel talking about the Bible and images in the Bible, we can have references to other religions, other mythologies. For example, this piece by Indian American artist Chitra Ganesh, who focuses on digital collage pieces. So her work pulls from both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, but also comics, pop culture, graphic art. And so the result is as much tied to dual heritage that she holds of India and the US, as well as queerness. All of those things are pulling together.
Yeah, it's great to see that kind of context in art, actually, because we're always looking at the Western tradition. So Marilena Ricci, I think that's your name, has put a comment there about the intrigued about the look of Caravaggio on his male models. It's a whole subject matter. This is a whole long talk, the Caravaggio. You know, very brilliant historians like Andrew Graham Dixon completely dispute the fact that he's gay. Others, you know, completely say he is. I would say that if there's any film you need to see in your lifetime, it's called Caravaggio, and it's directed by Derek Jarman, and it kind of really talks more about the Caravaggio as a person. It is something I'm going to be addressing at some point in my films, but it is a long subject matter. So I want to look at artists who have worked with gay subject matter. So if we jump to the next, no problem. If we jump to the next question, just come in a little bit closer, tiny bit closer to the image. Back a bit, a little bit back, a little bit. Stop. Okay. Does anyone know who this image is by? I'm not going to tell you this time. You're going to guess. So let's get some people involved. Who that image is by there. It's a very graphic image. Many people know an image without the person in it, which is in the Tate in London. I'm going to give you some clues. So he entered the Royal College of Art in 1959. Royal College of Art in the UK. 1959, homosexual acts were still illegal in the UK, and people were still being put in prison for it. So it wasn't until 1967 that it was partially decriminalized. So, you know, that's your background for this painting. So he looked at anyone want to take a guess? He really went for his identity as a young gay man. At a time it wasn't popular, but remember, the arts, it's a different ball game from, you know, let's say being in football or something like that. So he was kind of accepted, but it was still illegal. So later on, he's going to move to a more liberal environment. He come from the north of England, studied in London, and he's going to move to New York, where it's a lot more liberal. Believe it or not, it was then. And alongside his artistic development, he's going to become a pioneer of the gay subject matter. Any guesses so far? So we're getting no guesses here. This is David Hockney. There's David Hockney. So an openly gay artist. He's still working today. And this particular image was done in 1966. So just remember when this image was done. David Hockney, if you don't know him very well, he's a future subject of mine on a painting he did called Splash. So he come from dark, grey, dingy England, and went to live in California in the 1960s. Super exciting. And he really lived his life out there. And I'm talking about really, really lived his life. So, and he painted this. This was his boyfriend at the time. And this was his art dealer's Paul. Now we're going to go from someone like David Hockney. That's who that is, David Hockney. By the way, this is called Peter Getting Out of Nick's Paul from 1966. So we're going to go from David Hockney, who's very cuddly. So he's a very cuddly kind of gay, very kind of conformist. But, you know, even if he was working against the grain, you know, his images are very beautiful to someone else. Let's go to the next image, please. Let's see if you can guess who this is. So does anyone know who this is a photograph of? If we could go closer, real close in on his face. He's another Brit, another UK artist. And recently a work of his, by the way, sold for $84 million. Yay! Karnstein, you got it. Francis Bacon, well done. So he was born in Ireland to a wealthy family. Yay, everyone's getting Francis Bacon, but nobody got David Hockney. Francis Bacon is the hard one, I thought. But anyway, so recently work sold of his for $84 million, as I said. He was born in Ireland, so he's actually an Irish artist. Born to a wealthy family, born in 1909. And right from the start, he was bullied for being effeminate. But he was always unapologetically gay. He was totally out and open in the 1950s. That was pretty dangerous, being openly gay in the 1950s. Still illegal, and his work often referenced male sexuality. So we're going to go to the next image, which is from an amazing show at this one here is from an amazing show at the Royal Academy this year, which had lots of his unknown pictures. It's called Due Americani. That means two Americans. He painted it in Italy, so he gave it an Italian name. 1954. So paintings like this. So David Hockney was very gentle. He always had these younger, beautiful boyfriends. Francis Bacon pretty much went out with criminals. So he liked a bit of rough trade. And so he pretty much went out with guys when had sadomasochistic relationships with them. If ever you want to read a book about Francis Bacon, My Life in the Gutter is the best book about him. He was absolutely outrageous. Best friends with Lucian Freud.
The exhibit weighed 175 pounds, which is kind of the average weight of an adult man. And so the idea was that as the visitors took the candy, they're symbolically replicating the same deterioration, the same weight loss, and the same absence of his partner Ross, who was diagnosed with AIDS and okay, so I think we're back. If we could go on to the next slide. Hopefully we are.
It's still frozen. I've got the screen that they're watching as well. Now we are back. Hello.
We're back. Amazing. Hello, everyone. Sorry, we've had a little technical difficulty there.
Okay.
So, excellent. So if we can go on to the next slide, if possible. And hopefully...
It is on the regular screen now, Rowan, the Félix González-Torres.
So, yes. So, as James just said, we have a new piece here. This is a very... incredible piece. This is one of my favorite pieces of sort of participatory art, interactive art. So I don't know whether anyone can see if we zoom into the pieces that are on the floor, if anyone knows or if anyone can guess what is on the floor. It's lots and lots of tiny objects. And while you're guessing, I'll let you kind of know a little bit more about the piece. So essentially, this is an interactive piece of art. Visitors are invited to take a piece of what's on the floor there. And it was a series of similar exhibits, the most famous one being called Portrait of Ross in LA, where this pile of objects weighed the 175 pounds, so the average weight of an adult man. The idea being, as you took these objects, it replicated symbolically and kind of physically, visually, the deterioration, the weight loss, the absence of the artist's partner Ross, who was diagnosed with AIDS and died the year that it was exhibited. And ironically enough, the objects that were placed down are pieces of candy, a sweet, kind of what are associated with pleasant memories, kind of ironically became the symbol of this kind of death. And so I think we kind of see art reflecting historical events, personal pain, as well as love and joy. And I think that for a lot of queer artists at the time, the AIDS crisis was one such source of inspiration. So if we can go on to the next slide.
Keith Haring is on the screen.
Thank you very much, James. If you could just do that for me, perfect. So yes, this is Keith Haring, very iconic style. I think everyone knows his work when they see it. Very influenced by street art, by graffiti in the 80s. But a lot of people, I think, wouldn't necessarily associate him with the sort of social activism that he included in his work, and his work within the Silence Equals Death kind of movement. And the fact, of course, that he ultimately died from AIDS-related complications in 1990 kind of was such a huge part of his life. And I think what's really interesting is this very iconic style that he has essentially has this kind of threefold meaning to it, and reasoning behind it. So the first being, the figures covering their eyes and their ears, representing that silence equals death kind of slogan from the movement. The simplicity means it's very easy to reproduce, it's easy to kind of more accessible for people. And also the fact that all of the figures are identical represents both kind of the indiscriminate nature of the disease, but it also shows how the victims had been stripped of their humanity at the same time.
Yeah, and what's this is the AIDS crisis really started in 1981. But what's really interesting is that the AIDS epidemic hit New York City in particular in the early 80s. Literally just at the time the art scene was getting really interesting and really vibrant, with artists like Keith Haring, artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat, all these incredible artists, many who came from the streets as well and didn't go through art school. And so it hit them at just that time. So just as this amazing scene is taken off in the East Village, so we'll never really know how many people we lost during that period. Some artists like Keith Haring, of course, we know about, and there are many, many others we don't know about. So we're going to pull up the next image, please. Pull up the next image, please. And we're going to talk about artists who... This is Keith Haring. Sorry, this is a very political poster he did. Yep, and this is... actually, Rowan's going to talk about this. We're going to talk about artists who play with sex and identity. If you pull up the image after the Keith Haring, please, that would be great.
So I currently can't see what's being pulled up, but James is very helpfully doing that.
It's up now.
So this is actually a self-portrait by someone called Claude Cahun. So this is where it gets kind of interesting when we have people who write about their experience of gender, write about their experience of sexuality, but we know what pronouns they used while they were alive. And so she used female pronouns, she, her pronouns, but talked in her autobiography about the idea that neuter is the only gender that always suits me. So this kind of gender neutral cross-dressing, as it would be within the 1920s, both her and her partner, Marcel Moore. Such an interesting figure. I feel like I want to see an incredible documentary film, a biopic about this, because one of probably the most iconic acts, other than being an artist, was living in Jersey during the Nazi occupation and using their art, using their gender expression, disguising themselves at military events to slip anti-German flyers into the pockets of the men. All of these incredible acts that are paralleling kind of activism, gender, art, like all together, mixing those in together. And I think that's really kind of interesting and exciting to see people who are pushing those boundaries and kind of fearlessly subverting what was seen as normal at the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, we talk about people wearing men's clothing, men wearing women's clothing. as if it's something modern. It's actually not that modern, you know. And we're going to look at another artist now. If we could go to the next page, please. We go to the next image, please. And another artist who, this is from the 1850s, this artist. And this was Rosa Bonheur. If you could pull up the next image, please, that would be great. And it's a bit like, you know, RuPaul, the drag artist, the American drag artist from RuPaul's Drag Race, talks. Yeah, just leave that image where it is. Thank you. He talks about everyone dresses in drag. You know, a man wearing a suit going to work is a form of drag. You know, it's and these are what these artists are doing. They're playing with their whole gender. Rosa Bonheur was a revolutionary, very, very similar to Jeeun. You know, she lived openly as a lesbian in 1850. She had her hair short. She wore trousers, by the way. She wore men's trousers, but to wear trousers, she had to get permission from the police. And so you had to get written permission from the police for a woman to wear trousers. And her excuse was she was painting this painting you're looking at right now. So this was the horse market that she painted. She dressed like a man. Critics would say that she painted like a man. They quite often use those kind of terminology. In the same way that even 100 years later, the female abstract expressionists they used terms like pretty work. You know, they used all these terms, whereas the men got the masculine the descriptions of their work. She was one of the most successful women of her time. This painting in particular, it gave her a springboard. When was this? Sorry, 1850. This particular picture. This is I think it's 1852 or something like that. This is her masterpiece, and it shows the Parisian horse market. She showed it in Paris Salon. It became hugely famous. She became a celebrity when she traveled around America and Great Britain in the same way that Oscar Wilde was doing at the time, you know. So all these quite revolutionary characters were traveling around a country which over the years has got more and more conservative. So she was a cross-dresser, but her work, I don't think there's any way you could put any gayness into her work at all, actually, but that's okay. But it's important to know where she came from. She mostly painted lions, etc., etc. Now we're going to look at the next image, please. I'm sure you all know who the next image is of. So take a guess who the next image is of. I'm going to give some history. Well, you don't need to guess because it's written down there. So, but anyway, yes. As you know, this is Frida Kahlo. She's born in Mexico in 1907. She's only 47 when she dies. I did a film about her on my channel, Great Art Explained. But she managed to fit a lot in a very short lifetime. What's really important about Frida Kahlo, apart from her sexual identity, is a racial identity. This photo here was taken by her father, who was a professional photographer. So this is by Guillermo, her father. And he was German of Hungarian descent. What is really interesting about Frida, and no one knows why, she said he was Jewish and he wasn't Jewish. So no one knows why she said that. But, you know, her identity was very, very important. Her mother was Mexican, and later works like the two Fridas, she explores this biracial idea. And maybe talk more about her as a person, yeah.
Yeah, so Frida Kahlo was bisexual. I think a lot of people are very familiar with her, like the love affair with her husband and the drama of their romance and all this kind of stuff, but also both of them had many affairs, and she had many with women, including Josephine Baker, allegedly, which is, what a pair. That would have been a conversation I'd love to be part of. But we see her playing with gender and sexuality a lot in her work, kind of talking about kind of exploring these different identities, right? Mexican heritage incorporated through this kind of magical realism style. Disability, so obviously her childhood polio and her accident, she had a tragic accident, left her with chronic pain, with mobility issues, and so we also see these accessibility devices like braces, like wheelchairs in her work. And I was actually in Mexico in 2020, before, you know, it became 2020, and there was an exhibit at her house that was fantastic, that was all of her clothing that was so tied in with her accessibility devices, with her corsets that were made for her pain, made for her spine and her to make sure she could get around. And that was all part of her as an artist, right? You can't talk about Frida Kahlo without talking about all of these elements, because they were so integral to her work.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think with Frida Kahlo is one of those artists in particular you need to talk about that stuff more than most people. We're going to go to the next image, please. And this is someone who possibly might be, I don't know, maybe does anyone know who this image is by here? We've referenced it already. Let's talk about it while you're guessing. So this is a North American artist here. You can get bonus points if you say if you know who she is representing here. So this is a North American artist. She works with photography. She is heterosexual, but she totally plays with gender stereotypes. Mostly she plays with female gender stereotypes, but also men as well. And here yay, someone got it. Well done. This is Cindy Sherman. She also reinterprets classical images of Western painting. And here she is referencing the whole queer theory about Michelangelo, because this is his portrait of Bacchus that was possibly his boyfriend. Many disagree on that. And she references queer culture, particularly in performance. You know, it's all about dressing up and drag and all those kind of things. And next we're going to go to a different artist entirely. Yeah, Cindy Sherman as Caravaggio. That's a very, very good guess. If we could go to the next image, please. Yeah, pull back. Get us a nice shot of that. There you go.
So we have another question for you all. Here is the question. What do Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, and Jasper Johns have in common?
That's Cy Twombly, right? Is that image
yes.
there? That's Cy Twombly up on the screen there. So yeah, what do Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, and Jasper Johns have in common? So I'm going to give you some background. So the question is, what do they have in common? Not artistically. So on a personal level. If we could pull up the next image, please, while we're talking. Oh, good guess there. Not really. Okay, some people are doing some good guesses. So, yeah. So this is Rauschenberg. He was an American painter. He kind of foresaw the pop art movement way before Warhol, but they were very different artists. Jasper Johns, he was an artist who comes in the scene at the same time in the 1950s, and Cy Twombly, he's a scribbly guy. He's came around the same time. All three of them were very successful very early on. I'll tell you what the thing is they had in common. Yes, Dominique Lara, very good guess. They were together. Briefly sometimes, but yes, they were together. They've all had sex together. Let's be blunt about this. They've all had sex together, but they've all had their gay history erased from history. So this is going back to the points we were talking about earlier on. You know, what if you are reading about their history? Why don't you want to have your history mirrored in someone else? You know, why don't you want to have your heroes? This is a close-up now of the Rauschenberg, fantastic artists. So they all had numerous same-sex relationships, but every single one, and I just checked this morning to double-check, all of their Wikipedia entries ignore this, and so do most of their biographies. And it seems strange to me when a fiercely heterosexual artist like Lucian Freud and others who we all know, their sexual conquests are out in the open as part of their history. It's an important part of their history. So Rauschenberg's going to eventually marry a woman, but he also had an affair with Cy Twombly and later with Jasper Johns as well. So ridiculously, his Wikipedia entry doesn't even mention this. Twombly got married and had a string of male relationships. He also stayed friends with Rauschenberg. The official biography, which I read last year of Twombly, and that's released by the Twombly Foundation, who are a little bit dodgy, they erased all of his queerness. It's just outrageous, really. And they just coyly acknowledge that he sometimes spent winters with Rauschenberg in Florida. So these are three artists who all had some kind of sexual relationship, but all of their gayness or queerness was written out of history. Let's jump to the next one whose queerness wasn't written out of history, and that's Andy Warhol. Next one is Andy Warhol, and we're not going to talk much about him. He's pretty much well covered. Did their relationships influence their work? Absolutely. Sorry, that's a really good question, Marilyn. Guy Twombly really was influenced by Rauschenberg and vice versa. So it's really important. And then Warhol, he hid his sexuality, didn't really want to discuss it. He was a voyeur, really. Did he have sex? Well, if you watch the recent Netflix documentary, which is brilliant, by the way, apart from the music, then you'll find out, yes, he did. He had very long-term relationships. And you know what? The funny thing is, I've read every Andy Warhol book that exists. He's one of my heroes. I didn't know. You know, I knew that they had relationships, but not these long-term important relationships. Can we quickly jump to the next image, and then we're going to... The next image is Kehinde Wiley. Sorry, we're running out of time here. So next image is Kehinde Wiley. And this is an image of Barack Obama, which I'm sure most people know this. He painted this in 2018. Another future subject for one of my films. It's one of the most beautiful paintings. Really interesting here. Let's look at how interesting this can be. So the news coverage, when they had the news coverage of the unveiling of the Obama portrait, the first thing they said was Wiley was the first black artist to paint a presidential portrait. Not once, hardly ever since did they mention the fact that he's a queer artist. He has a queer identity and he associates with that. And there's a black historian, I believe that you interviewed him, right? Rowan? Yeah, George M. Johnson. And he's really interesting. And he says that Wiley's sexuality is an important part of the portrait, because some people are going to see this as thank you, Philip, for that comment. Yeah, sorry, you can't run out of time. We have things to do as well. But he is, it's an important, so he says it's an important part of that portrait because people see it as gay agenda, and it's not at all. Black queer people have historically faced the erasure of their identity in order to be accepted in black spaces and in galleries. You know, nobody talks about Jean-Michel Basquiat's sex life. You know, nobody talks about these things. It's always Madonna and blah, 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 blah. But there's other stories there as well. There's many stories. People have different levels of sexuality. Can we see the next image, please? And the next image is also by Kehinde Wiley, and this is John the Baptist 2. John the Baptist 2. I love his work here. An interesting fact, I interviewed Kehinde Wiley for my last film about the Venice Biennale. And an interesting fact is that my friend who I was with at the time said, oh, yeah, I see they're all wearing Louis Vuitton and wearing, you know, all these kind of fancy clothing. And, you know, are you sponsored by this company? And he actually said that's what the artist turned up in, you know. So when he was in Africa, he does a lot of work in Senegal, for example. They turned up in those outfits. And so this is just another image of him, and this based on a painting by Jacob Jordans, and that's a painting of John the Baptist. So he thinks his sexuality is just as important. Next, we're going to jump to an artist. I'll do a little bit of history, and then Rowan's going to talk about that artist, and also talk about something which I'm still not clear about as well, which is the term they. You know, it's I'm just being honest here. It's just a term that I'm still confused about how to use it. So we're going to do that in the context of an artist who uses the term themselves. So just to give you a little bit of history, this artist is probably my favorite living artist at the moment. And this is Zanel Mahuli. And she was, they were born, see, I did it. Sorry, Rowan. So they were born in South Africa in 1972, and they self-identify as a visual artist. And their development in photography is really intertwined with her their advocacy on behalf of the LGBTQ community in South Africa, by the way. So she founded a very important organization. They founded a very important organization called the Forum for the Empowerment of Women, FEW. And then they took a photography course, and now those works are shown all around the world. And Mahuli has produced many photographic series which look at how the LGBTQ plus community still faces violence in South Africa. There are still people, there was a news report just 2 days ago of gay people being beaten up and killed in South Africa again, you know. So they're still facing this, even though in South Africa equality is enshrined in its constitution. So this artist, they work with women, trans, lesbian, gay men, all people who face prejudice, and she kind of constructs a visual archive. 99.9% of the time using themselves as an image. So as you can see, I really struggled with theys and she's and he's. So it's something, you know, even someone who works in the arts, I'm really still not au fait with it. So Rowan, it'd be great if you could talk about this and maybe pull up another image.
Yeah, so if we put up the next image, which is another one by this artist. So I think that it's something that we see oftentimes when these terms enter more mainstream. They pronouns, they them pronouns, is something that's been used within the queer community for a long time. People are confused, but people they wanna use it correctly, you know. You want to respect people, but it's sometimes difficult to know how to use it. So the way I would think about it when we're looking at kind of non-binary identities and they them pronouns is, if you were to if I was to talk about an artist and I was to not tell you anything about them, if I just showed a piece of art and I said, this is by an artist, can you guess who they are? Can you guess who did this? They were born in this country, they did this, they did that. We're using they them pronouns pretty naturally then, because we don't know the gender of the artist. And I think, you know, people are so socialized, they're so used to seeing someone and automatically assuming, oh, this person must be she and this person must be he. And so a lot of people find it quite tricky to get their head around that kind of stuff. So I think that what I would give advice to people, I know a lot of people, you know, for example, might know someone in their life, maybe they work with them, or a friend who now uses they them pronouns, and they're always kind of wanting to be supportive and aren't quite sure how. I would say just practice. In the same way that if your friend got married and they went by a new surname, or like a colleague got married and went by a new surname, if you were introducing them, you might stumble for a bit to be like, oh, this is Sarah Smith. Sorry, it's Sarah Taylor now. This is Sarah Taylor. It's exactly the same. It's just trying to get used to it. And it's important to talk about this stuff because oftentimes the same as sexuality, the same as people's kind of gender, their ethnicity, their race, their religion, their class, like so many of these things will affect their art. It will be a focus, and it obviously is for this artist, specifically looking at archiving individuals from this community. And so we can see when we were looking before at the different artists who might have dressed in clothing that was non-traditional to their gender, had to get permission from the police. These kind of people, who knows, if they were living today, may well have used they them pronouns. We had an artist earlier who talked about wanting to have neuter as a gender, and that's very non-binary. That's very much outside of the realm of she and him. And so that's a really these things are always really interesting to talk about. We can't necessarily label people from the past, but when we're talking about people now, it's really exciting to be able to have them be open about their identities and to be able to learn a bit about how they see the world and how their concepts of gender and their own identity might change their art, might change the way that we view their art as well. And so we're almost come to the end of the live show, but we have one last sort of question, one last provocation for everyone, which might seem like a strange question, but it is, what is art? What do we think counts as art? So, you know, taking a step back, breaking down boundaries, talking about queerness, deceptively simple question, what is art? So we would love to hear in the chat whether you have any thoughts on this, if you feel like you have a definition or maybe a thing that you associate with art, as we talk a little bit about this topic more generally.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting here to interject with outsider art. You know, this is a term that not everyone has heard of. It's called outsider art. We use it a lot in art terms these days. And I recently saw a very huge collection at the Barbican. And in the 1980s, up until the 1980s, it used to be called art brut, so meaning ugly art in French. And it's a term that's used for work by anyone who's untrained or idiosyncratic work, you know, different ways of working, different types of art, people who are unconnected to the conventional art world. And I came from that world, and I'm really interested in people who don't come from that world. So sometimes not by choice, by the way, sometimes by circumstances. So the classic figures of outsider art were marginal figures. And they were totally, usually uneducated, and almost invariably had different views of the world. And these people produce work out of adversity. So it opens up the whole concept, as you say, Rowan, of what is art? What does it actually mean?
If we can move on to the next slide. I'm not sure if, James, you can tell me if it's with the names project.
Yeah.
Yep, so if we put up the next slide, please, would be great. Yeah, here we go, it's up.
Perfect. So looking at what people have said in the chat, right? Art is something that makes you feel and think, something that makes you feel something. It can be many things. It's any creative skill, anything that makes you wonder about something, a form of connection to creation, emotions. Think about all of these definitions as I'm going to go through 3 different kind of is it art ? Examples. So this is a piece of the AIDS Memorial Quilt, also known as the Names Project. So essentially a staggeringly large quilt made up of individually dedicated panels that were made roughly the size of the average grave to celebrate the lives of those who died of AIDS-related causes. So this is community folk art, some might say. This is just a kind of a crafting project, others might say. This is just a memorial, because it's not made by a team of artists, but by thousands of ordinary people paying tribute. Do we think this is art? Can we move on to the next slide?
And the project there is ongoing as well. Did you pull up the Can you pull up the next slide, please? Yeah, it's up.
So this, I'm pretty sure we'll recognize as a symbol, but this particular image is actually part of the original rainbow flag made by a team led by Gilbert Baker, of course. So originally this...
Just go back to the other image, please. Back again. Back to the previous image. The flag. Can you go back to the previous image of the flag, please? That's it. Thank you.
So originally the flag was an 8-stripe rainbow flag. It was hand-stitched, hand-dyed, and then turned into the 6 stripes so that it could be more easily replicated, essentially, so that they didn't have to use the pink that was a more expensive and hard to find material, and so it only had 6 stripes, so it could be used kind of 2 sides of a street during the the San Francisco Pride Parade. So now it's this kind of symbol that's been reproduced, utilized by the entire community. But the original flag, is this a piece of original artwork, the way that a painting or a sculpture might be that we might then get a print of? Or, we can talk about the idea of the rainbow flag being on pretty much everything, but don't we see the same outside of museums? Or, if you go to Florence, you're not going to see the David as tiny little statues that you can buy as a keyring and take home. Does the replication make it any less art just because it's used as a symbol as well? And finally, if we go to the next example, the next slide, what about
next image?
What about handmade protest signs? What about patches and buttons? Creativity, crafting, politics, all utilized in these sort of wearable canvases that are full of meaning. If we talk about meaning, and a lot of people talked in the chat about meaning being important to art, does this count? Does this count as art? Would we say, if we're thinking from the queer ground up, that handmade items so integral to our history should be seen as queer art just as much as pieces chosen by institutions to be displayed on gallery walls? So that's just a thought we wanted to leave you with, something a little bit queer, a little bit blurring the boundaries after talking about all of these great artists who are part of the canon. And we'll leave you pondering those questions.
Yeah, these are really interesting questions for you to think about, for us to think about. Art is supposed to evolve. That's the whole point of it. So we're going to finish up now. But before we go, just remember to subscribe to Google Arts and Culture. And you just click on the link below. So just click on that link down there below. And also I have a new video which comes out tomorrow on my channel, Explained, which is about 3 artists, Elaine de Kooning, Lee Krasner and Helen Frankenthaler. That's coming out tomorrow, and Rowan has a book out in the shops right now. So go to Rowan's.
Which I realised is behind me, which wasn't on purpose.
So hold it up to the camera, Rowan, and
thank you so much
remember
for my
to buy that book. So thank you very much for everything. Thank you, Rowan. You've been amazing. Thank you for all your explanations.
For all of your knowledge as well. I think it's great. I think it's great when you can get together people who have different kind of ins into the world of a particular topic, to try and see different perspectives on such an exciting topic.
Hasta luego.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.